Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, woven into cracks between stones that have watched empires rise, collapse, repent, and try again. And as you walk through the Vatican at this hour, in that soft in-between twilight where the city's heartbeat slows to a gentle echo, you feel the quiet hum of something waiting, something older than the gilded ceilings and cooler than the marble beneath your feet. The air is thick with incense residue from Vespers, clinging to your clothes like an overprotective grandmother, insisting you need just a little more blessing, and you move through corridors that seem unchanged since the 15th century, even though you know renovations come and go like impatient tourists. Somewhere in this delicate hush lies the mystery of a pope found dead in his bed, with no wound, no illness, no evidence of struggle, and no explanation that any Vatican chronicler has ever been willing to write down plainly, which is saying something considering this is the same institution that once casually documented the trial of a corpse. A mainstream historical fact that should, by all logic, be the strangest event associated with the papacy, and yet here you are, about to explore something far more unsettling. You move through the first courtyard, where shadows ripple across the windows as though the building itself is exhaling. And as you pass under an archway that feels colder than the rest of the air, you become hyper-aware of your breath, the soft scrape of your shoes, the subtle echo following half a second behind you, and the knowledge, unhelpfully dramatic, that you probably won't survive this, at least not without a spike in your late-night anxiety graph. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because I always love to see how many time zones accidentally sync up for bedtime stories about ecclesiastical mysteries. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, drifting deeper into the Vatican's private quarters, where the Pope's final hours remain locked behind silence and embroidered curtains that have seen more royal intrigue than half the kings of Europe. You turn right, slipping past a fresco where an angel looks suspiciously judgmental. You're used to this by now. And you step into a corridor known only to a few insiders as Il Passo dei Dormienti, the Passage of the Sleepers, a name given centuries ago when certain monks developed a habit of nodding off during their nightly watch. Some say it was due to spiritual exhaustion, but others whisper it had something to do with the cool drafts that never seem to obey architectural logic, a fringe tidbit that makes you wonder what exactly counts as paranormal versus poor ventilation in places built before modern engineering. The moonlight outside the small circular windows glows like polished bone as you walk, and each footstep sounds a little too loud, as if the corridor has forgotten what movement feels like. And perhaps it has, because no one has slept here for decades, not since the renovation that tried and failed to modernize these ancient quarters, a renovation the Vatican still insists was successful. Even though the wiring shorts out, if you try plugging in anything more ambitious than a lamp. Your path eventually brings you to a pair of heavy doors, carved with images of saints locking eyes with demons in poses that are either symbolic or accidentally comedic, depending on your level of sleep deprivation. And when you push them open, a cold breath meets you, the sort of chill that doesn't belong in a building warmed by centuries of human presence. This is the private papal apartment, or rather, one version of it, because the Vatican has had several across history, with popes sometimes switching bedrooms the way stressed managers switch offices. And as you step inside, you feel the uncanny stillness of a room abandoned in the middle of a life. The curtains are drawn, the bed perfectly made except for the faint indentation where one man lay down and never rose again. And the scent lingering in the air is a mix of lavender oil, old parchment, and something faintly metallic that you can't quite place. This pope, whoever he was to the world, left behind no signs of discomfort, no final prayer scribbled in haste, not even a glass of water knocked over in sleep. He simply ceased being alive, as though his story ended mid-sentence. And while historians have proposed everything from heart failure to secret poisoning to divine recall notices, none of those explanations make sense here. Not in this untouched room where nothing, not even time, feels like it has moved since that fateful night. You approach the bedside table, where a candle burned halfway down sits with its flame long extinguished, its wax forming ripples that suggest a sudden draft blew through moments before death, which contradicts every record claiming the windows were sealed tight. And as your fingers hover above the wick, you feel a chill snaking up your arm. The same kind you felt the last time you accidentally read a medieval remedy involving crocodile dung sunscreen. A callback that reassures you history has always been at least slightly unhinged. Beside the candle rests a small book, its leather cover worn and faintly cracked, and though you resist the temptation to open it, because you know better than to disturb any object in a papal death chamber, its presence alone hints at long nights and restless thoughts, the kind popes aren't supposed to admit they have, at least not in writing. The mainstream story recorded in official Vatican documents is predictably vague. The Pope died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by holiness, attended to by angels, accompanied by nothing more sinister than the gentle passing of an old soul ready for eternity. But you've already stepped past the threshold where official narratives begin to crumble, and you now notice the tiny inconsistencies that historians gloss over out of convenience. Why, for example, did the servants stationed just outside claim they heard nothing all night, not even the usual shifting of bedsheets? Why did the Swiss guard assigned to this entrance swear the air smelled strange, yet none of them could agree on what that smell was? And why did the monastery bell ring 3 minutes before dawn, a small but documented anomaly, when no one had pulled the rope? This last detail is one of those little elements scholars now call the ongoing debate, a phrase whispered with professional discomfort whenever this case resurfaces in academic circles. Some argue it was merely a timing error, others blame mechanical quirks, and a few, usually the bolder or more sleep-deprived researchers, suggest the bell rang because something else moved through the building at the moment of death. You lean closer to the bed, its sheets appearing freshly pressed, despite not being touched for decades, and you picture the final hours of the man who once ruled the Catholic world with signatures, blessings, and the occasional diplomatic eyebrow raise. What did he fear that night? Did he sense something in the air, some old tension creeping through the stone? Or did he drift to sleep believing morning would come as it always had, unaware that history was already preparing a footnote with his name and the words "cause unknown" attached? The deeper you breathe in this room, the more you feel the weight of centuries settling on your shoulders, pressing gently yet insistently, as though the Vatican itself is reminding you that mysteries here are rarely simple, rarely clean, and rarely meant to be solved. A soft tapping echoes somewhere far down the hallway, rhythmic and patient. Perhaps a gust flicking a shutter, or an old nun adjusting her rosary in her sleep, but it makes you tense without knowing why. The flicker of the moonlight against the gold trim on the bed frame turns the metal from warm amber to cold blue, shifting like a mood ring reacting to someone else's emotions. You run your thumb across the embroidered papal seal stitched onto the blanket, feeling the raised threads like veins beneath a thin surface, and for a moment you imagine the Pope lying here, hands folded, breath soft, face calm, the entire world oblivious to the fact that the man guiding millions would never open his eyes again. The silence deepens, thickens, and in it you sense something watching. Not malicious, not benevolent, but observant, as if the room has been waiting centuries for someone to step inside and notice what everyone else overlooked. A faint breeze touches your cheek, even though there are no vents in this part of the building, and as the air shifts, the candle wick trembles ever so slightly, as if exhaling a story withheld too long somewhere beneath your feet. The vast labyrinth of Vatican foundations groans with age, stone shifting against stone in soft, ancient complaint, and you realize you are standing not just at the site of a death but at the threshold of a secret, one carefully arranged, deliberately preserved, and possibly designed to outlive the truth it contains. You take one final breath in the cold, incense-soaked air, and in that breath you feel the echo of a presence long gone yet never fully departed, a reminder that death here is rarely just death. It is ritual, symbol, warning, and invitation all at once, and tonight you have accepted that invitation whether you meant to or not. You step deeper into the apartment, moving past the tall carved doors and into the smaller inner room where the Pope actually slept. And immediately the atmosphere thickens into a kind of impossible stillness that clings to your skin like humidity that forgot how humidity works. A quiet so dense it feels sculpted rather than accidental, as though someone once carved silence into the air and left it here to harden for centuries. The dim light that slips through the high windows looks pale and uncertain, casting long shadows that stretch across the floor in slow motion. And as you walk, your footsteps seem swallowed before they can echo, as if the room itself is refusing to acknowledge your presence. On the wall hangs a modest wooden crucifix, much smaller than you'd expect for papal decor, and you notice the way the candle stubs clustered beneath it never seem to melt evenly, which is odd because the room's temperature has remained constant since long before electric thermostats existed. Archivists once recorded that not even Rome's scorching summers could make this place warm, a detail so peculiar that one 19th century cardinal tried to have the room relocated entirely, which is objectively impossible, yet still ended up as a proposal in a Vatican ledger. The bed at the center is simple, almost austere, with clean white sheets pulled tight in the way only monastic discipline can achieve, and yet the pillows look slightly indented, as though someone rested there within the last hour, not centuries ago. You approach slowly, feeling the air sharpen around you, and you glance toward the window, half expecting to see it cracked open, but it is sealed tightly with iron clasps that haven't been undone since the night the Pope was found lifeless. The official Vatican archivum states that the waking servant entered at dawn to offer water and prepare the morning routine, only to find the Pope motionless, hands neatly folded, eyes closed as though lost in the gentlest sleep, a description so serene that historians often gloss over the truly disturbing detail. The room was colder then than it had been at any point during the previous winter, a mainstream historical fact quietly buried under environmental anomaly in the records. You stand closer to the bed now, noticing how the blankets seem untouched but not undisturbed, like someone made them up in a hurry and then smoothed them back down with a trembling hand, the kind of attempt to make a scene look normal that only ends up making everything more suspicious. Near the bedside table sits a silver cup, its rim tarnished in uneven rings, and although it's been cleaned countless times by cautious curators, you can still detect faint mineral residue like the ghost of a drink long evaporated. Some fringe theorists have claimed the Pope drank holy water every night to strengthen himself against visions, a claim usually dismissed but never formally contradicted because no scholar wants to be the one to write a footnote implying a pope was scared of the dark. The air grows sharper as you move around the bed, and that's when you notice the oddest detail of all, a small metal rosary on the floor. It's positioned too neatly to have simply fallen, lying perfectly parallel to the bed frame with its cross pointing toward the door, as though someone placed it with purpose, and yet the official reports insist the Pope retired for the night with only a wooden rosary, not this silver one with its faint engraving of a fish. A symbol traced back to early Christian iconography, whose exact interpretations remain part of what scholars politely call the ongoing debate. You crouch, touching the rosary lightly, and the metal feels colder than the stone floor beneath it, as if holding on to a temperature it shouldn't physically be able to maintain. When you stand again, you glance around and take in the room's impossible stillness. The way the curtains hang perfectly frozen, unmoving despite the faint currents you know must exist in a structure this old, and the way even dust seems reluctant to settle on the surfaces here, almost as if time itself is hesitant to enter this chamber. You walk toward the wardrobe, noticing how the carved wooden doors display delicate scenes of saints and martyrs, their faces serene, their poses graceful, their halos polished to a soft sheen by generations of careful hands. Inside, 3 papal robes hang in pristine condition, untouched by moths or discoloration, preserved through a combination of devout maintenance and what some Vatican workers jokingly, or perhaps not jokingly, call the leftover blessings from centuries of liturgy. One robe in particular, draped slightly forward as though tugged by an invisible hand, catches your eye. Its collar is embroidered with gold thread forming tiny geometric swirls, and the pattern seems almost too intricate for a garment intended for sleep, leading you to wonder whether the Pope changed into more elaborate robes that night for reasons the official narrative refuses to address. A faint scratch on the floor near the bed frame draws your attention next. It's subtle, barely visible unless the light catches it at the right angle, but when it does, the thin mark gleams like the trace of something being dragged slowly and deliberately, though nothing in this room appears out of place. You kneel, brushing your fingers over the mark, and you feel the faintest indentation, too shallow for furniture but too deep for a dropped object, which means it was made by something purposeful, or someone. Above the scratch on the wall, you notice a strange discoloration, a pale ring shaped like a thumbprint, though the surface is undamaged and clean. The archivists recorded this during early preservation efforts, but dismissed it as a natural stain, even though no similar marks appear anywhere else in the Vatican apartment. You move toward the nightstand again, your attention caught by the small gilded clock that sits atop it, frozen at a time just before dawn, its hands unmoving despite multiple restorations. The inner mechanisms were inspected repeatedly, with horologists concluding that the gears had no physical reason to stop, yet they did at the precise minute when the monastery bell inexplicably rang. Some scholars consider this mere coincidence, but coincidences in a place this old tend to accumulate until they no longer feel like coincidences. You glance toward the heavy drapes covering the tall, east-facing windows, their deep red fabric absorbing what little light remains in the room, and you notice how the folds sit too stiffly, as if starched in a way that defies gravity. When you lift part of the curtain, a small gust brushes your hand, despite the sealed window behind it, and the cold air feels like a breath escaping from somewhere it shouldn't. Your shoulders tense, and you take a slow step backward, letting the curtain fall in place again. You breathe in the faint scent of lavender oil, parchment, old linen, and something metallic, something you noticed earlier but couldn't quite place, a scent like the moment before a summer storm, tinged with ozone and tension, though the Vatican walls are thick enough to block out any weather. You approach the headboard and lightly touch the carved wood, its surface impossibly smooth for its age, and you imagine the Pope resting his head against it, unaware that his final night would pass in silence so profound that even the walls seem to refuse to hold the memory. The chamber grows darker as a cloud passes over the moon, and your eyes adjust slowly, tracing the faint outlines of furniture, the curve of the bed frame, the shimmer of the rosary, and the eerie perfection of a room that should not feel lived in but somehow does. You stand in the center, breathing slowly, feeling the chamber's impossible stillness wrapping around you, and you start to understand why this room has become the Vatican's most carefully avoided space, not out of superstition, but out of the simple, reasonable desire to leave mysteries untouched when they seem too quiet for comfort. You take one final glance at the bed, the soft indentation, the silent sheets, and the cold rosary glinting on the floor, and as you turn to leave, the air behind you shifts again, just a small whisper of movement, as though the room is exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. You step back into the hallway where the stillness of the Pope's chamber seems to leak outward like a slow-moving tide, and as you walk toward the small antechamber reserved for papal physicians, you feel the atmosphere shift from eerie silence to something more clinical, more purposeful, yet somehow even more unsettling, because this is the room where the first man to see the Pope's body tried to explain what he couldn't possibly explain. The door creaks open with the kind of long, tired groan that sounds like an old monk complaining about modern shoes. And inside you're greeted by a cramped but meticulously organized space that feels preserved in amber, every quill perfectly aligned, every parchment stacked with suspicious neatness, every jar of drying herbs sealed tight as if afraid to spill their secrets. The light is dim here too, but colder, sharper, as if bending around the truth that was once spoken between these walls, a truth that somehow managed to be both honest and evasive at the same time, because the papal physician, a man known in the records as Dr. Aurelio Serrani, described the Pope's death as entirely natural, a phrase so bland it should set off alarm bells in any investigator's mind, especially in a building where nothing is ever simply natural. You approach the wooden desk where Serrani supposedly wrote his report, and you notice the grooves carved into the surface, tiny lines forming arcs and spirals, the pattern of a man who must have been tapping or scratching the wood in quiet panic as he composed his careful lie. It's easy to imagine him sitting here, quill trembling slightly, not because he had something to hide, but because he had something he couldn't articulate, something that didn't belong in any medical textbook or spiritual manual. The mainstream historical fact attached to Serrani is that he once served as physician to 3 different pontiffs before this one, a feat that earned him a small footnote in Vatican records praising his consistent service across transitional papal eras. But what that footnote doesn't mention is the quiet rumor that each of those previous popes suffered strange nighttime ailments, insomnia, terrors, sudden chills. And although the official reports claimed standard causes, Serrani's private notes hint at patterns he noticed and then scribbled out nervously, leaving behind only faint indentations on the parchment. You find one such document now, preserved under glass, its surface marred by the ghost of erased sentences, the ink scraped away so aggressively that the parchment fibers frayed at the edges. Peering closely, you can just make out the shape of a phrase, the same presence, followed by an incomplete word that looks like it might have been returning or returner, though paleographers still argue over it in what has become an ongoing scholarly debate, a polite way of admitting no one wants to commit to a theory that might make them sound like they believe in supernatural bedtime stories. In the corner of the room sits a small cabinet filled with jars of dried flowers, oils, tinctures, and powdered roots, arranged with such obsessive precision that you imagine Serrani rearranging them nightly to keep his hands busy while his mind tried to form explanations he could never put into writing. One jar in particular stands out, a small vial containing a crimson powder labeled only ex nocte, meaning from the night. A fringe tidbit the archivists categorically refuse to elaborate on, except to note that the vial predates Serrani by several centuries and was already considered unusual when he inherited it. The powder remains sealed, untouched, its surface shimmering faintly under the glass, as though responding to the moonlight in ways simple chemistry should not allow, and you find yourself staring at it longer than intended, drawn to the color, the texture, the strange sense that whatever this substance is, the physician knew more about it than he dared to write. You move away from the cabinet, feeling the air grow slightly warmer the further you step from the vial, as though it radiates a coldness entirely its own, and you glance toward the physician's chair, a sturdy wooden seat with a cushion so worn it forms a perfect circle of flattened fabric. You imagine Serrani sitting here in the pre-dawn hours, summoned by frantic footsteps and hushed voices, being led down the hallway toward the Pope's chamber, his heart pounding with the dread of a man who has already seen things he cannot unsee. When he arrived, according to his own statement, the Pope looked as though he had simply drifted off mid-prayer, hands folded, expression calm, body undisturbed, except Serrani never actually wrote the word calm. That detail appears only in later summaries, not in his original testimony, which describes the face as peaceful yet alert, a contradiction he never explained. You picture the physician leaning over the body, checking for breath, pulse, warmth, and finding none of the usual signs of life or death, encountering instead the eerie stillness you yourself felt in the chamber moments ago. He noted a faint scent in the air, a sweetness with metallic aftertaste, which you recognize as the same scent clinging to the room even now, and although he mentioned it briefly in his early notes, it vanished entirely from the final report, replaced with the more acceptable phrase, customary incense remained present. You walk toward the desk again, tracing your fingers along the edge, and imagine Serrani's quill pausing mid-sentence as he wrestled with the choice between truth and safety, knowing that the Vatican preferred neat explanations to uncomfortable ones. His final report reads like a study in careful omission. Natural causes, no signs of struggle, peaceful repose, environmental conditions typical, no anomalies detected. A list so aggressively mundane that it practically screams the opposite. What's even more interesting is the small notation squeezed into the margin of his draft, circled twice, then crossed out with determination. It reads, "Windows sealed, no airflow, yet candle out." A contradiction that, once acknowledged, would have demanded further inquiry, so he simply erased it from the narrative and hoped no one would look too closely. You turn your gaze to the medical instruments, arranged neatly on a linen cloth atop the cabinet. Stethoscope, scalpel, small mirror, pulse needle, all carefully cleaned and polished long after Serrani's death. And you wonder whether he used any of them on the Pope, or whether he took one look at the body and realized tools would offer no answers here. The ambience in the room grows heavier, as though the walls are remembering something and choosing not to share it. You notice a faded tapestry in the corner depicting a scene of St. Luke attending to a sleeping figure beneath a canopy of stars, and for a moment you wonder whether the tapestry was chosen deliberately, a quiet nod to the idea that sleep and death exist in the same fragile space, one that can be crossed without warning. As you look closer, you see a tiny embroidered detail, a star stitched with silver thread slightly brighter than the others, almost glowing. Archivists claim this star is a later addition, though the reason or the artist remains unknown, adding another layer of mystery to a room already overflowing with unanswered questions. You exhale slowly, the weight of centuries pressing against your shoulders, and you imagine Serrani sitting here after examining the Pope, knowing he had witnessed something inexplicable, something he could neither confess nor ignore. Did he fear repercussions? Or was he afraid of something else entirely? The same presence hinted at in his erased notes, the same chill in the air, the same inexplicable stillness. You leave the room with its shelves of herbs, its faint metallic sweetness, its erasures and contradictions, and as the door swings shut behind you, you feel an unsettling certainty settle into your bones. The physician wasn't lying. Not really. He told the truth, just not all of it. You walk down the narrow corridor leading away from the physician's cramped little sanctuary, and with every step the air shifts back into that thick, padded silence the Vatican seems to keep in reserve for especially inconvenient mysteries, the kind where everyone involved insists nothing happened, even though the walls practically buzz with the opposite. This hallway leads to the servants' wing, the people who lived closest to the Pope's daily rhythms, who knew his habits better than most cardinals, who carried water, prepared meals, folded his linens, trimmed his candles, and yet somehow managed to hear absolutely nothing on the night he slipped from life without so much as a sigh. You push open the small wooden door at the end of the corridor, stepping into a long chamber with a low ceiling and beams overhead, the kind polished smooth by centuries of hands, dusting cloths, and quiet routines repeated thousands of times. It feels oddly comforting at first, like the backstage room of a massive theater where the cast prepares before stepping into history's spotlight. But the comfort evaporates when you remember why you're here. On the left, a row of narrow beds lines the wall, each neatly made even though no one has slept in them for decades, the pillows arranged with military precision, the blankets tucked so tightly you could bounce a coin off them, assuming you weren't afraid of waking whatever residual memory might still linger here. On the right, long wooden shelves hold rows of folded linens, white, cream, pale gold, each stack labeled in neat script, chamber towels, vestment cloths, night silks, and even a small bundle marked winter sheets, despite the fact that the Vatican rarely experiences the kind of cold that would justify such thick fabric. You stand in the center of the room, taking in the faint scent of starch, lavender, and old beeswax. And it's here you remember the official servant testimonies recorded after the Pope's death, all of which somehow say the same thing. They heard nothing, not a thud, not a gasp, not even the rustle of sheets. The chamber was silent all night, they insisted, even during the hours when the Pope usually stirred, prayed, or shifted in bed. Silence like that doesn't just happen in a building this old. The place is practically made of creaks, groans, whispers, and the occasional dramatic sigh of a wooden door hinge. But on that night, the servants reported a stillness so complete it unsettled even the most devout among them, though none of them admitted that part publicly. You move toward a small wooden table where a stack of ledgers sits open, the ink faded but still legible, and you scan the names of the attendants on duty that night. Sister Violetta, Brother Corvinus, Matteo the steward, Lucia the candle trimmer, and 2 young novices whose handwriting in the margins suggests they were prone to doodling fish symbols during dull shifts. Each name is accompanied by short notes: what time they woke, what tasks they performed, when they crossed the hall, when they checked the water jugs. Small details that normally wouldn't matter at all, except this time they do, because all their notes align with eerie consistency. None of them heard anything unusual. None of them saw candlelight under the Pope's door. None of them noticed a change in temperature until morning. And most suspiciously, none of them wrote down the detail that appears in every later retelling. The scent. That faint sweetness with a metallic trace, the one the physician mentioned before pruning it out of his report, the one you smelled in the papal chamber yourself. It's completely absent from the servants' accounts. It's possible they simply didn't detect it. Or perhaps they were told not to. One mainstream historical fact buried in the Vatican chronicles is that during several papal deaths of the 17th century, servants were barred from giving full testimony if their statements risked scandal or confusion among the faithful. A policy that sounds polite, but essentially meant erase anything weird before it becomes someone else's problem. You move toward the far end of the room, where a recessed alcove holds the servant's wash basin, a simple bronze bowl resting atop a stone pedestal. The water inside is still, impossibly clear, even though it hasn't been used in years. Archivists refill it periodically for preservation purposes, but they never drain it fully, and you've heard rumors, the fringe tidbit of the night, that the water occasionally ripples when no one is near it, as if mimicking footsteps that once passed through the room long after the living stopped walking here. You lean closer to the bowl, half expecting to see your reflection distort, but the surface remains stubbornly calm, like a mirror that refuses to acknowledge the present. Just above the wash basin hangs a simple iron hook where servants once stored keys, towels, or lanterns, and you imagine them moving through here in the early morning darkness, silent and dutiful, unaware that the most important man in Christendom was already dead in the next room. You turn and examine the small wooden lockers built into the wall, each carved with initials or symbols left behind by generations of caregivers, and you run your fingers over one that reads MC for Matteo, the steward inside. Preserved by the archivists more out of superstition than necessity, lies Matteo's final entry. A short note describing the hallway outside the Pope's chamber as still as a tomb during the night shift, a phrase that earned him a reprimand for morbid exaggeration and was scrubbed from the official record. Yet judging by the indentation of his pen strokes, Matteo meant every word he wrote. You take a few steps back, glancing once more at the line of narrow beds, the shelves of folded linens, the perfectly undisturbed dust on the floor. Not a footprint, not a scuff, not even a faint drag mark from a robe hem. And you realize something else unnerving. Normally, in old servant quarters like these, the air holds echoes, laughter, sighs, rushed footsteps, half-whispered complaints about long shifts or impossible tasks. But here, there's nothing. No trace of life at all, as if the room itself has forgotten anyone ever breathed within it. You stand still, listening, stretching your senses into the silence, and the longer you wait, the stranger it feels. Even buildings have memory. Old structures absorb the sounds of their inhabitants over centuries, yet this room is blank, wiped clean, sterile in a way that shouldn't be possible unless someone, or something, wanted it that way. A soft creak interrupts your thoughts as you turn toward the doorway, but when you step forward, the sound stops immediately, cut off mid-groan like a voice silenced before it can speak. You place your hand on the door frame and feel the wood cool beneath your palm, colder than any hallway you've walked through so far. You look back one last time, letting your eyes sweep over the room, the ledgers, the beds, the empty lockers, and the still wash basin, and a quiet realization settles into your mind with the weight of something inevitable. It's not that the servants heard nothing, it's that something made sure they didn't. You move deeper into the Vatican's private quarters, the weight of silence following behind you like a lingering shadow, and as you step into the narrow stairwell leading upward, the air changes again, becoming slightly warmer, slightly more intimate, as though you're approaching a place where someone once dared to be vulnerable. At the top of the stairs sits a small devotional room, the Pope's personal chapel, a modest space lined with dark wooden panels, a single pew worn smooth by nightly prayer, and a crucifix hanging above a narrow altar. The room smells faintly of candle smoke, trapped in the grain of wood, the kind that never fully dissipates no matter how many times archivists air it out. A soft glow from an unseen window frames the crucifix in pale gold, and as you approach it, you notice immediately what the original investigators pretended not to see. The crucifix is slightly crooked. Not enough for the casual observer to care, but enough for someone like you, already steeped in the details of this mystery, to sense that the tilt is intentional. You reach up to straighten it, feeling the smooth, cool wood beneath your fingertips, and as you nudge it gently, the crucifix swings outward like a tiny door, revealing the narrow cavity behind it. Inside the recess sits a thin, leather-bound diary, wedged carefully between the wall studs so tightly that only someone who already knew it existed would think to pull it free. You slide it out slowly, the leather stiff with age, the edges flaking, the cover etched with faint symbols, not crosses, not saints, but small, looping geometric shapes that seem more ancient than anything you've seen so far. The kind that appear in medieval manuscripts with marginal notes like meaning uncertain or symbol of unclear origin, which scholars like to classify under ongoing debate whenever they want to avoid admitting they simply don't know. The book feels unexpectedly heavy for its size, as if burdened by the words trapped inside it, words the Pope never intended to share with anyone. Certainly not with the Vatican chroniclers, who spent their lives polishing holiness into something neat and marketable. You open the diary slowly, careful not to damage the fragile spine, and the first page greets you with a single line written in slanted Latin, Noctes que redunt, nights that return. The ink is darker here, fresher, suggesting this was one of the last entries, written not long before the Pope's final evening. You turn the page and begin to read the small, cramped handwriting, the words spilling in quick strokes that betray urgency, unease, perhaps fear. He describes waking at strange hours, not because of noise. The palace is too quiet now, he writes, but because of dreams that feel borrowed, as though he were witnessing someone else's memories. The dreams repeat in cycles, each one beginning with a dimly lit hallway he does not recognize, though it resembles parts of the old Vatican that no longer exist. The hallway is always cold, colder than any winter night in Rome, and as he walks it in the dream, he hears footsteps that never catch up to him. At the end of the hallway is a door he cannot open, though he feels something breathing on the other side. You continue reading, feeling your own breath slow as the room grows heavier. The Pope writes of waking with a chill clinging to his bones, of candles extinguished without cause, of the faint metallic sweetness in the air. The same you smelled, the one the physician tried to scrub from his report. He writes about seeing the curtains tremble when the windows are sealed, about the way the rosary on his nightstand sometimes shifts position, about finding small scratches on the wall near his bed, scratches that archivists later dismissed as pre-existing wear. He also writes of the servants, though in a tone not of suspicion but sorrow. They hear nothing, he notes, because something wills itself unheard. You feel a tingling along your spine as you reach the middle of the diary, where the handwriting becomes more erratic, the lines slanting upward as if written with trembling hands. In one entry, he describes waking to find the room filled with a soft hum, a vibration so faint it could be mistaken for distant chanting, though no monks were on night duty that week. He describes shadows moving without sources, cold spots forming suddenly, and a recurring vision of a star stitched into darkness, the same symbol embroidered into the tapestry you saw earlier in Serrani's chamber. This is your mainstream historical fact, buried in plain sight. Several medieval popes kept private notes about unexplainable nocturnal experiences, though the Vatican has long considered such notes personal reflections rather than evidence of anything unusual. But what the chronicles omit, what becomes your fringe tidbit tonight, is a rumor recorded in a single 14th century manuscript claiming some popes believed they inherited not just authority, but also a burden, a nocturnal visitor, a presence passed down the generations like a shadow that never fully dissolves. This diary, you realize, is part confession and part warning. The Pope writes of feeling watched at night, but never with hostility, more like curiosity or expectation. He writes of praying for clarity, of asking whether the silence creeping into the palace was a sign of divine presence or the absence of it. One entry stands out. If I am taken, let them say I died peacefully. Let them not look deeper. You turn another page and find a passage that seems almost too calm. The Pope writes of a night when the air grew unnaturally still, when even his heartbeat felt muffled inside his chest, as though the room itself were listening. He describes sitting on the edge of his bed, rosary in hand, waiting for something he could not name but had come to expect. He writes of a faint shape forming near the foot of the bed, not a person, not a vision, but a density in the darkness, like a shadow thicker than itself. The candle beside him went out in an instant. The room grew so cold his breath crystallized in the air, and then the shape dissolved, leaving silence so deep it felt physical. You turn to the final pages where the handwriting shrinks into narrow, cramped lines, squeezed into the margins as though he had run out of space, but not urgency. The nights return, he repeats several times, and each one brings the same stillness. The last full entry ends with the words, "If tomorrow comes, I will speak to Serrani." But tomorrow did not come. You reach the final page, empty except for a faint indentation, as though his quill hovered, ready to write something he never had the chance to put on paper. You close the diary slowly, the leather creaking softly, the pages whispering like old breath, and you return it to the recess behind the crucifix, letting it rest in the darkness where it was hidden for so long. As the crucifix swings back into place, its edges aligning perfectly with the wall, the room seems to settle around you, the air growing still, heavy, expectant. You step back toward the doorway, the candle smoke scent curling around your senses, and you feel the weight of the Pope's unspoken final thought lingering in the room like a quiet heartbeat. Whatever he intended to say, whatever he meant to confess, now falls to you to uncover. You leave the intimate hush of the chapel behind and step into the broader halls where the echo of footsteps and muted conversation carries the weight of centuries. And as you move through the corridors, you can almost feel the subtle tension in the air, the invisible lines of power and rivalry that run beneath the gilded ceilings like hidden aqueducts of ambition. This part of the Vatican was once home to the senior cardinals, those who wield influence with a smile that conceals teeth sharper than any dagger. And as you walk past the portraits lining the walls, each face painted with eyes that seem to follow your own, you can almost sense the centuries of politics folded neatly into every pose, every ornate cloak, every elaborate hat. A mainstream historical fact remains that the College of Cardinals has always been a hotbed of rivalry, where papal elections, even today, involve careful strategy, secret alliances, and the occasional whispered threat. Though now these intrigues are sanitized into ceremonial procedures and polite descriptions. You stop briefly at a long oak table, polished by countless hands over centuries, and notice faint scratches and small dents that appear almost like messages left in code. traces of tension embedded into the wood by those who have long since passed. The faint scent of parchment and candle wax lingers, mingling with something sharper, metallic, almost like the faint tang of blood, though there is none, and you realize this is one of those fringe tidbits rarely acknowledged. Rivalries in the Vatican sometimes escalated in ways that skirted the line between ritual, politics, and danger. And though historians debate these claims, one cannot entirely ignore the evidence etched into both the architecture and the oral histories of those who worked here. You continue down the hall toward a smaller antechamber where private meetings would have taken place, and as you enter, you notice chairs meticulously arranged in a semicircle, as though anticipating a debate or a subtle confrontation that could erupt at any moment. And indeed, the room has heard many such confrontations over the centuries. A carved lectern stands at one end, worn smooth where cardinals' hands have rested, fingers tracing symbols that may have been idle doodles or deliberate gestures meant to intimidate colleagues, and you can almost picture the room alive with tension, whispered words, subtle nods, careful eye contact, and hands resting just above hidden daggers in smiles that never reach the eyes. One wall is lined with small cabinets containing documents so sensitive that only a select few ever glimpse them, the contents describing property disputes, secret alliances, and the occasional moral accusation against a fellow cardinal. Archivists today label many of these items unverified or under review, though some contain precise dates and signatures that suggest the opposite. You pause in front of one of these cabinets, brushing lightly over the cool wood, imagining the subtle power plays that unfolded here. One cardinal suggesting a policy change with a polite phrase, another smiling benignly while plotting how to ensure it fails, and a third quietly recording the proceedings for leverage later. The air in this room carries an almost tangible anticipation, as though the walls themselves remember every whispered plan and every quiet betrayal. In the center of the room sits a single chair, its cushion worn and sagging, where the most ambitious of cardinals would have positioned themselves, and you imagine a scene on the night before the Pope's death. 3 or 4 figures leaning in, speaking in hushed tones, their words courteous yet weighted, glances exchanged like silent duels, every smile a hidden dagger. One fringe detail that appears in marginal notes is a reference to the candle of envy, a symbolic gesture supposedly used by cardinals to indicate secret alliances during nocturnal meetings, though some scholars insist this was merely decorative, while others argue it reflects a long-forgotten ritualized practice whose meaning has been deliberately obscured. You move to a small window overlooking the inner courtyard, where shadows of statues fall across the cobblestones like frozen sentries, and you consider how these rivalries may have subtly shaped the Pope's final days. Decisions made in this very hall, words spoken in tones too polite to betray intent, could have ripple effects reaching far into the chambers where the Pope slept. You imagine the subtle network of influence, letters exchanged under the guise of diplomacy, messages hidden in plain sight, favors promised and debts silently called in. A faint breeze from the open window carries the scent of stone and distant gardens, a reminder that despite centuries of politics, the world outside remains indifferent. Yet within these walls, human ambition twists and turns in nearly imperceptible ways, creating patterns of tension that can linger even decades later in the atmosphere itself. You step closer to a set of portraits depicting past cardinals, and in the half-light, you see the way some eyes seem to glint knowingly, as though aware of secrets the living have forgotten. One figure in particular, painted with a subtle smirk, seems to watch you, and you catch yourself imagining the conversations that must have unfolded behind closed doors, the subtle calculations, the manipulations conducted with smiles that mask motives sharper than any blade. The more you linger, the more aware you become that even centuries later, the chamber retains its energy. A quiet hum of rivalry, anticipation, and the ever-present dance of power. A small side table holds an assortment of scrolls tied with ribbons, each one meticulously labeled, some with dates and events, others with symbols whose meanings are now obscured. contributing to the ongoing scholarly debate over how much of papal history has been influenced by these quiet, smiling strategists. You imagine a night not long before the Pope's death. The cardinals gathered here, plotting with precision, weighing the balance of influence, exchanging coded glances, unaware that the unfolding events in other parts of the Vatican might intersect with their schemes in ways no one could have predicted. The hall seems to vibrate slightly as you take it all in, the weight of ambition and secrecy pressing gently around you. Each carved line in the furniture, each scratch in the wood, each echo in the corridor seems to whisper that the history of the Vatican is not only written in official decrees, but also etched into the very architecture by the intentions, rivalries, and hidden smiles of those who lived it. As you step back toward the main corridor, leaving the chamber of ambition behind, the smell of candle smoke, wax polish, and old parchment follows you, mingling with the faint metallic tang you've noticed in the Pope's private quarters, tying the threads of influence, observation, and silent power together into a tapestry that seems impossible to fully unravel and yet irresistible to trace. You leave the rival cardinal's chamber and step into the shadowed corridors where the echoes of whispered intrigues still linger, and as you move toward the section of the Vatican once designated for the Swiss Guard, the air feels different here, cooler and heavier, almost as if the very stones are remembering the tension of a long-lost watch, the kind that keeps secrets longer than any ledger ever could. The narrow hallway twists slightly, polished stone walls reflecting the faint candlelight, and at the end of the hall, a small wooden door leads into a modest guard room, one so unassuming it seems impossible to imagine it as the stage for events that would ripple across the Vatican's history. Inside, the room is stark, a row of neatly folded uniforms, polished halberds resting against the wall, and a single chair pushed up against the table where reports and schedules were once kept. A mainstream historical fact records that Swiss guards have always served both as ceremonial protectors and as real security for the Pope, tasked with vigilance at every hour of the day and night. But what you notice immediately is the absence of something even more striking. The night guard assigned on the Pope's final night, a young man named Caspar Lindauer, seems to have disappeared entirely from the official records, leaving behind only his empty bed and the faintest scuff marks near the door. You step closer to the bed, noting the way the linens remain folded almost ritualistically, untouched since the moment of his last shift, and the pillow holds a slight indentation, as if someone had rested there briefly before vanishing. Archivists make no mention of this anomaly in published works, dismissing it as an administrative oversight, but fringe accounts hint at something more peculiar. The guard reportedly failed to report for duty the following morning, and no one, not even senior colleagues, knew his whereabouts for weeks. A disappearance so clean it borders on the impossible. You move to the table, brushing aside dust, to reveal faint pencil marks on a scheduling sheet, small lines and circles that might have been made by a distracted hand or by someone mapping patterns of movement through the corridors, but they stop abruptly, mid-sentence, mid-strategy, as though the guard's thoughts simply evaporated. You imagine Caspar standing at his post that night, eyes scanning the dimly lit hallways, ears attuned to every creak, every whisper, every hint of motion, feeling the weight of centuries of duty on his young shoulders, when perhaps he glimpsed something he was not meant to see. One page of a private log, later found tucked under a floorboard by a janitor decades afterward, contains a single cryptic phrase, "Not mine to bear." The ink is faint, the handwriting unsteady, suggesting a man grappling with something beyond his comprehension. You place your hand on the halberd leaning against the wall, imagining Caspar grasping it tightly, his knuckles white, feeling the presence of a room, a corridor, and perhaps an entire palace silently observing him. The fringe tidbit, whispered among a few retired guards, claims that at the precise moment of the Pope's death, Caspar's body temperature dropped several degrees lower than anyone could account for, a detail never officially recorded, yet noted in private correspondence between colleagues who wished to make sense of the inexplicable. You move to the corner where a small wardrobe sits, polished but showing the natural wear of years, and imagine the guard reaching for his uniform in the early morning hours, only to find the fabric heavier than expected, the room seemingly thicker, the shadows pressing in slightly, though he is alone. The scholarly debate here is subtle, but persistent. Did Caspar vanish due to fear, due to coercion, or as part of something more mysterious, something that intersects with the recurring pattern of unexplained phenomena around this particular papal death? You walk toward the small window facing the inner courtyard, the moonlight casting a long, pale triangle across the floor, and as you trace it with your eyes, you imagine the guard's glance flicking toward the Pope's private quarters, noting every detail, the slightly shifted rosary, the faint metallic scent in the air, the impossible stillness of the room. All of these details, ordinary to some, extraordinary to others, create a pattern that is almost, but not entirely, understandable. You step back toward the door, noticing the faintest scratch along the sill, like something or someone was trying to leave but couldn't quite complete the movement. And you imagine Caspar tracing that path, silent and careful, aware that even the walls could witness his hesitation. You run your fingers lightly along the polished stone, the air around you tingling subtly, as if in acknowledgement of all the secrets the guard carried, and the sudden realization dawns. Caspar's disappearance is not merely an administrative anomaly, but a quiet echo of the same forces, seen and unseen, that claimed the Pope without explanation. The room itself seems to hold its breath as you leave, the uniformed shadows lingering in the corners, the halberds leaning like attentive sentinels, and the faint metallic tang that has marked the Pope's chambers now seeming to follow you through the guard room, a reminder that nothing here is coincidental. Even decades later, the corridors and rooms retain memory of Caspar's last steps, his unfinished logs, his unspoken warnings, and the soft pressure of silence that compels you to move forward carefully, aware that the events of this night, unseen by the wider world, resonate through time with quiet insistence. The vanished guard, like a ghost in uniform, leaves behind a presence that feels more substantial than any human body, an absence made dense with possibility, forcing anyone who steps here to acknowledge that some mysteries do not merely disappear, they linger, folded into the architecture, into the air, into the very rhythm of the Vatican at night, awaiting someone like you to notice and remember. You leave the guard room behind, the lingering chill of unanswered questions pressing at your shoulders, and make your way through narrow stone corridors toward the Vatican archives, a place steeped in silence so profound it feels almost deliberate, as though centuries of record-keeping have layered upon themselves to create a living memory of secrecy. The archivist's office is small and cluttered, every surface piled with leather-bound volumes, delicate manuscripts, and scrolls that smell faintly of old ink and beeswax, an aroma so potent that you can almost feel the weight of history pressing into your lungs. Mainstream historical records confirm that Vatican archivists were tasked with preserving documents meticulously, and many of the texts stored here span back to the 9th century. Yet what you notice immediately is a subtle difference in the orderliness. A section of manuscripts appears deliberately unsorted, edges exposed, pages curling just so, as if someone had deliberately left them accessible, daring a reader to notice. Behind a tall oak desk, an archivist sits hunched, hands clasped over a stack of letters, the corners of his eyes crinkled in a mix of concentration and mild amusement. He is said to have refused orders to destroy certain manuscripts during past purges, an act that earned him quiet reprimands and cautious admiration, a mainstream fact that historians note with understated awe. You move closer, noticing that the light from the small window falls unevenly across a shelf where several bound volumes sit, and one in particular catches your attention. Its spine is unmarked, and yet it radiates significance, a subtle hum of importance that seems impossible to ignore. The archivist glances up, his gaze steady and curious, and you feel the weight of unspoken stories pressing against you like the thick stone walls around the room. He gestures toward the shelf, and though he says nothing, the message is clear. These pages contain secrets even the Vatican preferred to forget. You pick up one of the manuscripts carefully, feeling the fragile paper beneath your fingertips, noting the ink that has faded but retains an almost imperceptible shimmer, a fringe detail whispered about by a handful of scholars that some inks used in the 16th century were mixed with trace metals, giving them properties that resisted time and tampering in ways modern science struggles to fully explain. You open the manuscript to a page describing nightly observations of unusual phenomena surrounding the Pope's private quarters. Candles extinguishing without reason, drafts appearing from sealed windows, and unexplained shifts in shadows, recorded meticulously by servants whose identities were later obscured. The archivist watches as you scan the page, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, a human acknowledgement that the weight of this knowledge is almost a game, teasing those who dare look too closely. You notice marginal notes, scribbled in a different hand, commenting on the accounts with cautious language, and some are deliberately crossed out with heavy pen strokes, as though the original reader had second thoughts about preserving these insights. One phrase catches your attention: "The nights breathe with memory," a statement so enigmatic that it invites speculation, and indeed scholars still debate its exact meaning, some interpreting it metaphorically, others suggesting a more literal, uncanny explanation. As you turn the pages, you find diagrams of corridors, notes on candle placement, and cryptic symbols etched into corners of the parchment, annotations that seem to map more than just physical space, hinting at patterns of unseen movement, of presences that linger where no human stands. You run your fingers along the diagrams, the edges of the paper rough and frayed, and imagine the archivist bending over these same pages decades ago, eyes trained, mind calculating, choosing which details to record faithfully and which to obscure with subtle ambiguity. You realize that he preserved these documents not just out of duty, but out of an almost reverent acknowledgement that some truths were too dangerous, too delicate, to ever be made fully public. The air in the room grows heavier, the faint scent of ink blending with the lingering metallic trace you followed through the Pope's quarters, through the guard rooms, and now here, suggesting a continuum, a subtle trail of mystery that binds these locations together. You glance up and notice a small framed note behind the archivist's desk, yellowed with age, reading, "Destroy nothing, let the past speak when ready," a directive he seems to have taken literally. You understand then that this man is the custodian not merely of documents, but of memory itself, preserving fragments of events that official histories have chosen to sanitize. A quiet thrill runs through you as you handle another page. It details the sequence of the night the Pope was found, cross-referencing witness statements, candle positions, and even the precise timing of distant bell chimes, all carefully noted yet ambiguously phrased to avoid explicit conclusions. Each annotation invites speculation without offering resolution, creating a tapestry of uncertainty that mirrors the tension of the Vatican itself. You notice a faint indentation on one page, a line erased but still perceptible, suggesting a thought abandoned midway, and you imagine the archivist hovering over his work, wrestling with what to preserve and what to conceal. The scholarly debate around these materials is subtle but persistent. Some argue they are purely clerical records, a mundane reflection of administrative diligence, while others insist they contain veiled testimony of events so unusual that official acknowledgement would have caused scandal, fear, or even panic. You feel the room leaning toward you, as though its walls themselves insist on recognition, and you realize that the act of preservation here is an active defense against erasure, a quiet rebellion against enforced forgetfulness. As you return the manuscripts to their shelf, the archivist rises slightly, a gesture almost imperceptible, signaling approval or perhaps acknowledgement of your comprehension of the delicate balance between truth and omission. You step back into the hallway, leaving the scent of old ink, faint metallic tang, and lavender lingering in your senses, and feel the subtle weight of secrets, carefully curated and almost impossibly fragile, pressing around you. Every footstep toward the next chamber resonates with the understanding that the archivist's refusal to burn pages has allowed the past to whisper into the present, to shape your journey through this night of unexplained death, silent corridors, and unseen forces. In this building, memory is a living entity, and he, like you, has been given the rare privilege and burden of observing it without disrupting the fragile balance maintained over centuries. You leave the archivist's sanctuary behind, stepping into a narrow passage that leads downward, the air growing cooler, heavier, carrying a scent of stone, earth, and something almost imperceptibly sweet, like the faintest trace of incense trapped for centuries. And as you descend, the walls close in, etched with centuries of worn carvings that suggest lives once lived. Prayers whispered, footsteps hurried, and footsteps paused in awe or terror. Beneath the Vatican lies a labyrinth of necropolises, tombs, and passageways stretching farther than most tourists ever imagine. A mainstream historical fact. Excavations have revealed early Christian burial grounds and pagan shrines coexisting under the foundations, their presence documented in manuscripts, maps, and official reports, though only a fraction of their tunnels have ever been fully explored. You move carefully along the stone path, feeling each step reverberate through the labyrinth, and as your eyes adjust to the dim light, you notice the faint outlines of niches, sarcophagi, and plaques, some inscribed with names long forgotten, others intentionally left blank, a fringe tidbit that has puzzled scholars for decades who debate whether blank markers were symbolic placeholders or sites deliberately erased from memory. The air is almost tactile here, pressing against your skin as if the labyrinth itself remembers every soul that has passed through it, and you imagine the Pope's footsteps above, the quiet movements of servants, the creak of halberds, all overlaying the stillness of this subterranean world. A narrow side corridor leads to a cluster of crypts, and the temperature drops a few degrees as you approach, the stone walls exhaling coolness like breath long held, a subtle reminder that death is patient and the past eternal. You notice a faint shimmer along the walls, the residue of ancient minerals catching the dim light, a subtle, almost imperceptible guide marking a path taken by others long ago, some perhaps intentionally, others by accident. Among the crypts, you see small alcoves carved for private interments, each containing traces of offerings, dried flowers, rusted candle holders, small scraps of parchment bearing prayers in scripts spanning Latin, Greek, and other tongues, the accumulated devotions of generations, whispering their secrets into the quiet. A particularly narrow passage opens into a chamber where a central sarcophagus rests, unadorned, save for a faint, almost worn engraving that seems to pulse in your peripheral vision. The effect subtle, uncanny, and precisely the kind of detail that fuels ongoing scholarly debate. Was it an intentional optical effect created by the stonemason, or evidence of something unexplained lingering in the stone? You crouch to examine it more closely and notice a small indentation along the edge, one that could have been caused by centuries of visitors leaning or by some unknown hand seeking to leave a message. The smell of old stone is accompanied by a faint metallic tang, the same scent you've traced through the Pope's bedchamber, the guardroom, and the archivist's office, now seeming to bind the levels together into a single, unbroken thread of mystery. As you move past this sarcophagus, you notice a series of narrow alcoves, each containing smaller, more modest remains, and you reflect on the fringe tidbit noted in early 20th century studies. Certain popes and cardinals requested burials with specific orientations and spacing, allegedly to prevent spiritual disturbances, though no document clarifies the exact reasoning, leaving scholars debating whether these were symbolic measures, precautionary rituals, or attempts to manipulate forces beyond comprehension. You step along the worn stone floor, feeling faint vibrations beneath your feet, subtle and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing from a past long settled, yet somehow persistent. And you realize that this rhythm could easily be explained by the natural settling of ancient stones, or it could be something else entirely, a hidden pattern unnoticed by generations of caretakers. The passage narrows further, forcing you to move sideways, tracing the walls with your fingertips, and as you do, your hand brushes over a rough surface where centuries of inscriptions have been chipped away, leaving only shadows of letters and symbols whose meanings are lost, yet whose presence is undeniably deliberate. Here, the air feels thicker, heavier still, and you imagine the Pope above unaware of the weight pressing beneath his palace, the necropolis bearing silent witness to his final night. and perhaps influencing events in ways that no living human could account for. You pause at a junction where three narrow corridors converge, each lined with niches and low tombs, and you feel a momentary vertigo, a subtle dizziness that suggests the labyrinth is aware of your presence, calculating the echoes of your movement, the pull of your curiosity. One of the corridors leads to an open chamber where the faint light of a concealed window illuminates mosaics depicting angels and faintly sketched figures in mid-motion, their forms blurred just enough to seem alive, shifting imperceptibly as you move. And a fringe account notes that early caretakers reported seeing similar shifts in the mosaics at night, though skeptics dismiss these tales as imagination influenced by candlelight flickers. You take a careful step toward the mosaics, observing the subtle play of shadow and light, and realize that the necropolis, though centuries old, seems designed to be interacted with not just physically, but psychologically, a space that challenges perception, patience, and perhaps sanity. Faint inscriptions along the walls, mostly eroded, hint at prayers for protection, warnings to passers-by, and cryptic references to nights that return, echoing the diary hidden behind the crucifix above. You notice a small stone niche in the corner, filled with remnants of wax seals and small charms, and though the mainstream historical interpretation calls them ceremonial offerings, you feel a deeper resonance. They are perhaps markers, indicators, or guides left intentionally, messages to those who would come later, like yourself, tracing the threads of events leading up to the Pope's mysterious death. As you move back toward the junction and prepare to continue deeper, the faint heartbeat-like vibration beneath your feet seems to quicken slightly, the metallic tang in the air intensifying ever so subtly, as if the necropolis itself is acknowledging your presence, the living walking among the dead, tracing patterns of events that intertwine above and below, connecting the final hours of a man whose life and death remain shrouded in silence. Each stone, each inscription, each faint trace of movement seems deliberate, preserving a memory that official chronicles refuse to acknowledge, and you feel the subtle thrill of understanding that beneath the grandeur, ritual, and politics of the Vatican, there exists a quiet, persistent truth, a network of memory, shadow, and consequence, awaiting recognition by anyone willing to descend into its depths and observe without interruption. You ascend from the necropolis into a warmer corridor, the cool, dense air giving way to the familiar scent of polished stone and lingering incense, and soon find yourself in the hall that was once used for the Pope's private evening meals, a room where light, conversation, and ritual intertwined with subtle undertones of hierarchy and quiet tension. The table is long, made of aged oak polished to a soft glow, with a slight curve worn into the wood where countless elbows once rested, mainstream historical fact. Papal private suppers were carefully orchestrated affairs, designed not merely for nourishment, but for the performance of piety, protocol, and discreet observation of those in attendance, a practice meticulously recorded in countless diaries and administrative logs. You notice the traces left behind, faint scratches near the edges where cutlery was repeatedly placed, subtle depressions in the tablecloth that suggest chairs were moved or weight shifted, and the residue of candles that burned unevenly despite careful placement, hinting at a night that was far less ordinary than the records imply. A fringe tidbit, whispered among certain Vatican historians, notes that on the eve of the Pope's death, the menu included a rare combination of spices and dishes whose origins were deliberately obscure, ingredients believed in superstition to either protect or expose the soul, depending on the correct preparation and timing, though official accounts only list them as luxury fare. The room seems to hum faintly as you move, the polished floor reflecting the dim candlelight in such a way that shadows seem to shift and lengthen, as though reaching for something unseen, and you can almost hear the quiet movements of servants, attendants, and the Pope himself, each gesture deliberate, measured, cloaked in the delicate balance between ceremony and comfort. You examine a silver goblet at the table's center, its rim etched with tiny symbols too fine to read without close inspection, and you imagine the Pope raising it in toast, unaware that it would be one of his final acts, a gesture recorded in passing notes but omitted from the main narrative. Alongside the goblet, a small plate holds remnants of food that have long since decayed, yet the faint scent of herbs and spices lingers in the air, mingling with the metallic tang that has accompanied you from chamber to corridor to crypt, connecting disparate spaces with a single uncanny thread. You crouch slightly to inspect a chair at the table's far end, noting the way its legs are subtly uneven, a detail later explained by restorers as normal wear, though you suspect it may have been an intentional adjustment, a slight tilt allowing the observer a better vantage on the Pope's position, or to influence seating order in a room governed by protocol and unspoken rules. The scholarly debate is quiet but persistent. Did certain elements of papal feasts serve symbolic protective functions, or were they mere manifestations of tradition and opulence? The room itself seems to answer in silence, its centuries-old walls bearing witness to gestures, glances, and movements that official records choose to omit. You run your fingers along the carved edge of the table, tracing the lines that centuries of meals, ceremonies, and conversations have left behind, imagining the subtle interplay of power, observation, and ritual as the Pope dined with his attendants, each aware of their roles, yet perhaps oblivious to the events unfolding simultaneously in other parts of the palace. A candle flickers unexpectedly, though no draft is perceptible, casting a shifting shadow across the table and floor, and you sense a deliberate choreography in the way light interacts with objects and occupants, a faint reminder that nothing in this space is accidental, from the placement of dishes to the trajectory of shadows. You notice a folded napkin at the Pope's place, its fabric pressed with care, edges aligned perfectly with the plates and utensils, yet slightly askew, betraying the final moments of a hand that set it down but never lifted it again. The metallic scent intensifies here, mingling with the aroma of herbs, roasted meat, and old wood, creating a layered olfactory memory of the evening, one that seems to resonate with echoes of whispered conversations, quiet laughter, and subtle warnings exchanged across the polished surface. You imagine the Pope looking around the table, noting the faces of his attendants, the weight of tradition, the subtle politics of seating order, unaware that his life would soon end without explanation, leaving behind only traces recorded in marginalia, erased logs, and faint impressions on furniture. The room hums faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though remembering the evening in its entirety, preserving the exact sequence of movements, sounds, and scents, a silent witness to the cusp of transition from life to death. You run your hand along the table's edge once more, feeling the subtle grooves worn by countless fingers and the faint pressure of presence that seems to linger above each chair, a resonance of lives lived, conversations held, and unspoken tensions that ripple invisibly through space and time. As you step back toward the doorway, leaving the table and its layered history behind, the candle's flickering shadows stretch and merge with those from the hallway, connecting the feast, the chambers, and the crypts in a continuum of light and silence. The metallic scent, the cool stone, the hum of memory, and the faint residual warmth of human presence combine to leave you with the undeniable sense that the Pope's final evening was not merely a meal, but a carefully orchestrated intersection of ritual, observation, and unseen forces, one that set the stage for the inexplicable silence that would follow, and one that now compels you to continue tracing its echoes deeper into the heart of the Vatican. You return to the physician's chamber, the air thick with the faint scent of old herbs and candle smoke, and as you step across the threshold, the weight of history presses against your shoulders once more, the quiet hum of stone corridors echoing faintly through the walls like a memory reluctant to fade. On the desk lies the original report, meticulously transcribed but conspicuously edited, and beside it rests a smaller, overlooked document, a second examination conducted quietly, privately, days after the official findings were submitted, a mainstream historical fact noted in footnotes but rarely discussed outside scholarly circles. You pick up the document, noting the careful handwriting, the precision of the language, and the subtle hesitations in punctuation that betray a mind attempting to balance truth with discretion. The report describes measurements of body temperature, pulse, and other vital signs taken posthumously, revealing contradictions that defy ordinary explanation. Warmth in certain areas despite overall coldness, subtle discolorations in places where circulation should have ceased uniformly, and faint irregularities in the alignment of the limbs, as though the body were resisting the stillness imposed upon it. A fringe observation is noted in a delicate margin, the subtle presence of a metallic scent clinging to the skin and surrounding air, one that was not accounted for by herbs, candles, or nearby metals, an anomaly scholars debate endlessly, oscillating between chemical explanation and unexplained phenomenon. You trace the lines of the report with your fingers, imagining the physician, quill poised, deliberating over each detail, aware that any misstep could invite censure, ridicule, or worse, and yet compelled to document what he saw, no matter how difficult to explain. The notes describe minute observations: a slight indentation in the mattress where pressure should have dissipated, a subtle shift in the folds of the bed linens, and a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the candle flames during the examination, recorded with the precision of someone striving to honor both science and secrecy. You notice references to the second night, when Serrani reportedly returned to verify measurements and inspect conditions once more, and the text hints at the physician's unease. Conditions persist, anomalies unchanged, followed by an erased line that hints at a more direct acknowledgement of phenomena he could not articulate. The air in the room feels heavier as you read, the metallic tang stronger, wrapping around you like a silent companion, reinforcing the notion that this space holds memory as tangibly as it does objects. Marginal notes reference the servants' testimonies, the vanished guard, and subtle shifts in light and temperature, all tied together by observations too precise to ignore, yet too inexplicable to fully integrate into official reports. You examine diagrams sketched hastily in the margins, illustrating spatial relationships, positions of the body, angles of light, and airflow, yet all annotated with cautionary notes and hesitant question marks. A testament to the physician's struggle between empirical observation and the impossible realities confronting him. Scholars have debated whether these diagrams represent careful scientific reasoning or unconscious attempts to encode what could not be spoken aloud, an ongoing debate that persists even in contemporary analyses. You notice a small section where measurements are repeated, figures crossed out and recalculated multiple times, the repetition almost ritualistic, a subconscious attempt to reconcile observed facts with expectations, and you feel the faint echo of that frustration as you trace each figure with your fingertip. The report notes the presence of subtle irregularities in the body's tissue, discrepancies that were cross-checked multiple times, and yet Serrani's notes never assign a cause, only observation, leaving a gap between what is seen and what can be explained. A small entry refers to a disturbance in nocturnal energy, phrasing so cautious it could mean anything, yet its placement within the measurements and observations suggests that even he considered it significant. A fringe tidbit that modern scholars have noted but rarely pursue due to its ambiguity. You flip to the final pages where the physician concludes that all observed data point to natural death, though nothing in the measurements or conditions fully conforms to ordinary expectations, a subtle contradiction that is never reconciled. The margins carry his own handwritten thoughts, lightly scratched and erased in places. If interpreted literally, results contradict understanding of life and decay. A confession that hints at the impossibility he faced, a silent acknowledgement of phenomena not meant to enter the public record. You set the report aside, feeling the room's weight press in from every side, the metallic tang lingering, shadows stretching, the faint flicker of memory resonating through stone and wood alike. It becomes clear that the physician, through careful observation and deliberate omission, left a record that is both confession and concealment, a testament to the limits of knowledge, the fragility of human perception, and the subtle persistence of the unexplained. As you leave, the echoes of his second examination follow you, merging with the stillness of chambers, corridors, and crypts, a reminder that in the Vatican, even facts are filtered through centuries of caution, secrecy, and the enduring presence of mysteries too complex to simplify. You move away from the physician's chamber, the echoes of his meticulous observations fading into the stone corridors, and step toward a small, seldom-used alcove that seems almost hidden in plain sight. The air cooler here, weighted with dust, wax, and the faint trace of old incense that refuses to dissipate, as though the space itself remembers secrets long concealed. Within this alcove lies a narrow door, set flush with the wall, unmarked save for a subtle indentation where hands have pressed repeatedly, and beyond it is a chamber no ordinary visitor is allowed to enter, a mainstream historical fact confirmed in several confidential Vatican inventories. Certain rooms exist solely for the storage of documents, artifacts, and objects deemed too sensitive or dangerous to be widely known, overseen by a select few custodians sworn to silence. You push open the door, and the smell of old parchment and stone immediately washes over you, thick and grounding, yet tinged with the same metallic sweetness you have followed throughout the Pope's private quarters, the guardroom, the crypts, and the chapel, linking disparate spaces through a single invisible thread. The chamber is small but densely packed, shelves of manuscripts, jars filled with powders and tinctures, boxes marked with cryptic symbols, and one particularly conspicuous case made of dark wood bound in iron, sitting at the center like a sentinel. A fringe detail whispers that the case contains relics and texts never recorded in official histories, items associated with rituals, omens, and warnings intended to be observed only in extreme circumstances, though historians debate whether these objects were protective, symbolic, or instruments of influence, an ongoing scholarly debate fueled by the occasional leak or fragment discovered in secondary sources. You approach the case cautiously, running your fingers along its iron-bound edges, noting the subtle scratches, dents, and the faint warmth radiating from its center, a presence that seems almost conscious. You remove the lid, carefully, reverently, and inside lies a collection of small scrolls, each tied with ribbon and marked with dates, symbols, or names that do not correspond to any known record. A collection so precise and yet enigmatic that it feels simultaneously curated and chaotic. One scroll bears the inscription Noctes que redunt, recalling the diary hidden behind the crucifix, a direct connection that makes the hairs on the back of your neck prickle. The Pope had evidently referenced this phrase before, suggesting awareness of an ancient secret, a presence or pattern repeating through time, cycles of night that return in ways unaccounted for in ordinary chronologies. You lift another scroll, its edges frayed, revealing symbols and shorthand annotations, an intricate system of observation that seems to track phenomena across rooms, floors, and even centuries, documenting irregularities that officials deemed irrelevant or inconvenient. Flickering candles, drafts in sealed chambers, shadows behaving independently of their sources, faint metallic scents, minor shifts in objects, and a subtle feeling of being watched that defies simple explanation. The meticulous nature of these observations implies careful attention, patience, and awareness of patterns invisible to ordinary eyes, yet the interpretations remain deliberately opaque, a method of recording truth without attracting scrutiny. You notice one parchment, heavily annotated with small diagrams and marginal notes, outlining specific nights, times, and locations where anomalies were most pronounced, referencing the Pope, servants, guards, and even particular furnishings, a level of detail that borders on obsessive, and yet there is no explanatory key, no definitive meaning provided, leaving the data tantalizingly incomplete. Scholars have long debated the intent of such records. Were they intended to protect, to predict, or to control? One fringe interpretation suggests the notes represent a hidden framework of influence, a system of observation that linked physical spaces to unseen forces, though this remains speculative. open to debate and deliberately unprovable. You lift a small vial from the shelf, the liquid inside dark and shimmering subtly, almost alive, and you note that the label is entirely absent. Archivists remark that some substances were stored without identification precisely to avoid panic or misuse, yet you cannot shake the sense that the material itself is imbued with significance, the remnants of rituals, practices, or knowledge deliberately concealed. The room hums faintly, a subtle vibration that seems tied to the objects themselves, and as you step back, you perceive a connection threading through the alcove, the manuscripts, the powders, the diary, and the Pope's private chambers, a continuity of secrecy, observation, and unacknowledged phenomena that has persisted through centuries. One manuscript, fragile and yellowed, describes what could be construed as ceremonial preparations, aligning with the unusual meals, candle placements, and precise timing noted elsewhere, suggesting a pattern of protective ritual, though interpretations vary widely, and scholars debate whether these actions were genuinely mystical, symbolic, or purely procedural. You sense the weight of responsibility pressing around you, as if merely observing these items is an acknowledgement of knowledge too delicate to disclose, and you realize that every careful annotation, every hidden symbol, and every sealed vial exists not for the public record, but to preserve a balance, one the Pope and his closest advisors understood, yet never fully explained. The metallic tang intensifies subtly, threading through the alcove like an invisible current, connecting objects, rooms, and memories, reminding you that some truths, while preserved, are not meant to be fully articulated, only observed and respected. You step back, closing the case gently, the air settling around you as if the chamber itself exhales, and you feel the cumulative weight of secrecy, memory, ritual, and observation pressing against your consciousness, a reminder that some forces, some knowledge, and some presences are deliberately left undisturbed, existing quietly beneath the veneer of ordinary life, waiting for those willing to see them without disrupting their careful equilibrium. As you leave the alcove, the faint hum and metallic scent linger in your senses, carrying with them the reminder that this secret, though hidden for centuries, continues to shape events, rooms, and lives. A quiet yet persistent thread binding the Pope's final night to the present and connecting everything you have observed so far in ways subtle, deliberate, and inescapably compelling.